Thank you very much for having me today. My name is Paul Chandler. I lead the Net Zero Travel and Transport team at NHS England. Before that, I worked more broadly on the Greener NHS programme across a number of work streams. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about this morning, the role that estates and facilities teams can play in that broader decarbonisation of the NHS. So firstly, some context. Many of you will be familiar with this, but I'll just run through it quickly for those that might not be aware. In 2020, the NHS became the first national healthcare system not only to declare an ambition to get to net zero, but also to publish a detailed plan to get there, delivering a net zero NHS. Many of you have read that. If you haven't, I'd recommend you look it up on the NHS England website and take a read. That had two really broad, world-leading targets within that document. Firstly, to reach net zero carbon emissions for the emissions that the NHS could control directly to net zero by 2040. That's all the emissions shown there on the left-hand side on the in the white rectangle, and includes many of the estates and facilities core functions: buildings, energy, waste, water, etc. But we've also committed to reaching net zero for all of the other emissions that we can influence, primarily through the way that we commission services and spend money, by 2045, and that's going to be a much more difficult target to secure. And you'll see on the right-hand side of that chart a number of other functions that sit within estates or facilities management: food and catering, business services, potentially some freight and transport might sit within there as well, and ICT. So really, if we're going to reach our net zero carbon emission targets as the NHS, we're going to need estates and facilities teams to play a really key and pivotal role in a number of those areas, and I'd just like to highlight what those areas are today. NHS England's Greener NHS programme's role is basically to oversee progress and to develop any support, resources, tools for the NHS frontline to be able to deliver local plans on decarbonisation. So how are we doing so far? Well, actually, the NHS has made fairly good progress. Over the last 30 years, we've reduced our direct carbon footprint by 62%, which is pretty good going, from 16.7 million tonnes to 6.1 million tonnes. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. Most of that has been delivered through estates and facilities team, primarily through energy efficiency programmes, but also just a general decarbonisation of the national grid, moving away from coal to cleaner forms of electricity generation. When we look at the total carbon footprint, so everything, including what we spend our money on, progress, as you can see, has been much, much slower, although has started to accelerate in the last 10 years or so, primarily because the world in general is taking decarbonisation more seriously, and the advent of new technologies, which makes it quicker and cheaper to decarbonise. But we've got a long, long way to go. In terms of the carbon footprint in 2019 and how that breaks down, estates and facilities are directly responsible for about 15% of our total carbon emissions, or about 40% of those direct carbon emissions from the things that we deliver ourselves. You can see there in that green segment, about 15% primarily on building energy and waste and water. The vast majority of our carbon footprint is actually on things that we spend the money on, things that we might buy in, medical devices, equipment, anything the NHS spends the money on. It will have to play a really crucial role in making sure that when we do spend our money in the NHS, that we are building in decarbonisation to all of those contracts. More on that a little bit later on. So, the Greener NHS programme has set some pretty ambitious, aspirational really, targets for carbon reduction over the first 3 years of the programme, and there they are in summary. National government actions at the bottom there account for quite a large proportion of that decarbonisation. They relate to things like the ongoing decarbonisation of the national grid. The national grid is committed to being net zero carbon emissions by 2035. It's got a very, very long way to go to reach that target, and it's behind schedule at the moment. And it also relates to things like improving vehicle emission standards as well, and that's a rocky road, as you may appreciate. Estates and facilities, though, has been given the third largest carbon reduction target over the first 3 years of the programme by the Green NHS programme, about 800 kilotons of carbon. It's a very steep hill to climb. However, there is some good news. The public sector decarbonisation scheme, which many of you will be familiar with, invests a lot of public sector funding into specific projects to decarbonise estates and facilities. And the NHS has done pretty well in securing this funding. In phase 1 and 2, we got about 28% of the money that was available for the total public sector, 281 million. In phase 3, we did really, really well. 66% of the total funding available for the public sector went to the NHS for schemes to decarbonise heat, power and energy. We did so well in phase 3A, in fact, that they changed the rules in phase 3B to make sure that no sector could get more than 35% of the total. And the NHS did secure its 35% of that total in phase 3B. So overall, the NHS has had about over 800 million of investment over the last couple of years in specific schemes to decarbonise primarily heat and energy. It's important to say this is testament to the organisation and hard work of estates and facilities team. It's quite a strange process that runs for this. It basically runs on a first come first served basis. The money's available, and within about an hour of the deadline of the window opening, the funds are fully committed. So testament to NHS teams who have secured this money. It does mean that decarbonisation will be uneven across the country. Those trusts that have been able to secure significant funding will go pretty fast. Those who haven't yet will obviously have a slower decarbonisation journey, and we recognise and appreciate that. The cumulative lifetime carbon savings of that 828 million is about 2.5 million tonnes of carbon. That's not every year, that's for the entire life cycle of those projects. Some projects will run for 10 years, some will last for 30 years. So it's a big step in the right direction, but we're not home and hose. There's a lot more that we will need to do over the next 5 or 10 years on estates and facilities. Beyond core estates and facilities, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of other work streams that will be reliant on estates and facilities teams to support and help lead those decarbonisation efforts. I'd like to summarise some of those for you this morning. Firstly, in my area, travel and transport. It's key that we change the way that NHS staff travel, both to work, for staff commuting, for work through business travel, and the vehicles that we own and operate ourselves. Facilities teams will have a role in terms of providing the infrastructure that people might need to switch to active travel, walking, cycling, or improving public transport to and from NHS hospitals. For example, having covered bus shelters on hospital sites or real-time bus arrival time displays, etc. There's a really key role that estates and facilities teams can play that to make those options more attractive and more viable for NHS staff. Most of the travel and transport decarbonisation, though, will be delivered through a wholesale switch to electric vehicles. And again, estates and facilities team have a really key role to play in that, in terms of helping to design and implement the refuelling infrastructure, the EV charge points that NHS fleets will need to switch to electric. And car parking will play a really key role as well. There's a talk this afternoon about car parking from Manchester, so I won't say any more about that there. But already you can see key roles for estates and facilities within travel and transport. The same is true in medicines, primarily nitrous oxide. Now, nitrous oxide is a very powerful greenhouse gas. 1 tonne of nitrous oxide has the same global warming potential as 289 tonnes of carbon. So it's a really big deal. NHS spend quite a lot of money on nitrous oxide, but the audits that have been done to date suggest that most of that is not actually used for patients. A big study in Scotland found that over 90% of the money they were spending on nitrous oxide in pipe systems was simply leaked into the atmosphere. It just wasted straight into the atmosphere, wasting money, creating more global warming. So there's a really key role for estates and facilities teams to play in, firstly, auditing. Do you need nitrous oxide? Nitrous oxide is typically used in maternity units, clinically. It's also piped into a lot of operating theatres up and down the country who very, very rarely, if ever, use that nitrous oxide. So a key role for the teams here today in terms of checking, how much money you're spending on nitrous oxide, how much of that actually makes it to the patients working alongside clinical teams to do those audits. And then examining, do you need that piped nitrous oxide? Can you shut those systems down completely? To save carbon, to save money, and to save management effort in the future. That where you do need piped nitrous oxide, making sure that your manifold systems are intact, that you're not leaking nitrous oxide unnecessarily, will be a relatively straightforward way to tackle carbon emissions and to save money. Probably add those kind of things onto your cost improvement plans in future because it's fairly effective. And then stock control and storage. In that Scotland example, about 10% of the nitrous oxide paid for expired in the canister. Don't really understand how nitrous oxide can expire, but it went past its use-by dates. What happens there is that's sent back to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer just simply releases that nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. So if you can tackle that, improve your stock control, you'll be saving money, you'll be saving greenhouse gases as well. Thirdly, supply chain. As I mentioned, every time the NHS lets a contract now, at least 10% of the score that you give to bidders has to be weighted towards social value, including fighting climate change. That's a minimum 10%, and we'd encourage estates and facilities teams when they're letting things like cleaning contracts, for example, when they're letting things like construction contracts, that you think really clearly about how you can use the money that you're spending to encourage your suppliers to decarbonise their operation, to eliminate modern slavery, and to deliver another range of social value beyond the core thing that you're purchasing. We'd really encourage people, where possible, to use local contractors, primarily because it boosts the local economy and boosts local employment, but it can also reduce the need to transport people and materials as well, and can therefore have a carbon and air pollution benefit as well. And encourage people to think really closely about the durability of designs and materials. I've worked at the NHS for 20 odd years. I know that quite often a contract is let on what's the cheapest, but thinking about the full lifetime of that project, is it worth spending a bit more and having something more last a lot longer? So those kind of procurement decisions will become increasingly important if we're going to meet our net zero carbon targets. And finally, adaptation and resilience. We've all seen, including early on this week, climate change is here to stay. No matter how effective we are in reducing emissions, we're going to have to adapt to the impacts that are here now. Increased flooding risks, all of those CTs we have in basements in hospitals will be at risk of flooding in future. How do we mitigate the impacts of those or protect those assets? Extreme heat will lead to increased fire risks as well, so how do we protect our estate from those kind of threats? And energy resilience as well. As temperatures rise, the demand for electricity typically goes up, and the national grid could be subject to a blackout. So how do you assure yourselves that your power supply is resilient and that you've got backup systems to deliver core services when you do have an outbreak? So lots and lots of things for estates and facilities teams to think about moving forwards. A really key role for the profession to play in that. Of course, we're not expecting everyone to do all of that straight away, and the Greener NHS programme and NHS England is trying to set out a stepwise project in bite-sized pieces ultimately. This is what we're asking regional teams to coordinate with trusts and integrated care systems for this current fiscal year. The estates in the bottom left-hand corner is fairly obviously for estates teams to lead, but there's a number of other elements within other work streams that estates and facilities teams will be crucial in supporting or leading the delivery of. I've already talked about nitrous oxide, already talked about an ambition for up to 11% of the NHS fleets of vehicles to be zero emission or hybrid by the end of the year. That's a stretch target, I'm not sure we'll get there. The data that we've got for this year suggests that it's around 8% for last year, so 11% will be around the right kind of ballpark. But of course, if we're going to have zero emission vehicles, we're going to have somewhere to refuel them. I'll talk about the detail of that in a breakout session this afternoon for those that are interested in the detail. And we're also asking trusts to invest in what we call modal shift in facilities and infrastructure to enable more staff to travel by cycling, walking or public transport if they want to, and if that's a viable option. But that will need things like lockers, it will need potentially showers, security, lighting, potentially safe cycle routes, those kind of things. So roles for estates and facilities teams to play in that as well. And as I mentioned as well, anything that we procure, a real clear view about how do we extract a carbon benefit from that, from the money that we are spending. This isn't just a movement that NHS England has dreamt up. There's lots of clinical teams, lots of clinical societies that are picking up the challenge. The Royal College of Emergency Medicine have created a Green ED accreditation framework off their own back. We're asking some trusts to trial that. That will have implications for the layout of EDs and potentially some requirement for estates and facilities input into there. Similarly, Green Theatre checklist, again, designed by the Royal College of Surgeons, not from us. So clinical teams will increasingly, off their own bat, come up with other ways about how they might tackle their carbon footprint, and we won't necessarily control all of those, but they'll be coming to you guys increasingly to say, I've got this idea, can we make it work, how can we make it work, how can you support me? So this movement, it will hopefully will only get bigger and generate momentum as we go. I'd like to finish with a few key messages then in summary, if I may. Firstly, climate change presents multiple threats to NHS infrastructure and consequently our ability to treat patients. We can't ignore it, it's here now, we've all seen the evidence. It's only going to get hotter, it's only going to get wetter. We need to accept that and do everything we can to mitigate the worst impacts of that. The NHS actually now has a legal duty to tackle climate change and adapt to its effects through the Health and Social Care Act of 2022. So this is nice to have this as a legal requirement that all of your boards will be responsible for ensuring is delivered in your organisations. As we mentioned, estates and facilities teams have long led the way. That 62% reduction in direct carbon emissions over 30 years has primarily been through the work of estates and facilities teams, again, primarily on energy efficiency, but through other things as well. There will be a law of diminishing returns. At 38% of direct carbon emissions is going to be much more difficult to deliver than the first 62%. That's fairly obvious, I think. But on the plus side, new technology breakthroughs are happening all the time. PV, solar panels weren't really viable a few years ago. Photovoltaics now not only viable, but they are generating massive operational savings for trusts who can invest in them. For example, heat pumps didn't exist a few years ago. Now they're providing alternatives to decarbonise your heat system, for example. Same could be said for EVs. There are many more opportunities to tackle climate change that we'll run through today beyond your core functions as a estates and facilities team, and I would urge you all to think about how you might support those efforts, whether it's clinical teams coming to you and saying this is what we want to do, can you help, or you're thinking a bit more broadly about some of the things I've mentioned today. And just to finalise by saying, the NHS is really leading the way globally here. Since we have declared our net zero plans, over 40 other national healthcare systems have come to the NHS and said, we want to do something similar, can we learn from you? And we're running a programme now to bring some of those national healthcare systems up to speed. But there's pockets of innovation, brilliant innovation everywhere. You'll see some of the examples today. So the NHS is in a really good position, and it's around looking around, networking, understanding what your neighbours are doing, what the successes they have had, and NHS England will play a really front and centre role in that. But it is possible. You won't be able to do it all at once, but identifying what might work for your neighbours, how you might be able to tailor it to your own circumstances, and how you can go after some of those carbon emissions, it will be really key. And there is a lot already out there that's working, so I'd encourage you to look around, to network and consider how you might be able to deliver some of those in your own organisations. That is it from me. Thank you very much.